Hi, my lovely friends. I hope you guys are doing good today. Today, I'm going to discuss poker and game theory a little bit. I think that it's something that I can add to the channel that will be somewhat useful. I know that there's a lot of content on game theory and poker, so certainly this is nothing new, and there may be other people out there that do a much better job at explaining what I am explaining. Certainly, out of the context of poker, there are infinite people that are far better at what I'm explaining. However, I like the element of just history, and I like the element of the ways that game theory can be applied to poker and the reasons why it's important. So I wanted to add this to the channel. I think that this channel's main purpose is actually to uh, discuss expanding our mind. However, game theory is one of the approaches that we can do this with. I think it's very important to understand how poker actually works from first principle, rather than collecting knowledge and assuming that all of these assumptions that we have are actually correct. We have to go in and question everything. So let's delve into ideas of why game theory is very important. There's a very famous philosopher. His name was Plato, and he wrote a number of books. In one of his books, the Locks, and also the Symposium, he basically spoke about Socrates talking about an episode from the renowned Battle of Delium. In I don't know exactly when it was. I think it was the I don't know. Anyways, it was in the BC. It's probably about 400 BC because that's when Socrates was around. Uh, and basically, the whole entire narrative was, and the entire story that Socrates was talking about, was that the soldiers were contemplating whether or not they should actually stand at the front of the battle line. The first soldiers, the front soldiers, were questioning whether or not they should even do this, because they faced the realization that whether the defense is successful or not, there's a very high possibility of death. So the individual soldier concludes that the optimal alternative is just to run away, irrespective of actually like the country's outcome, battle's outcome. They seem to be very intelligent people, but unfortunately, I don't think this is them. I think this is Socrates. Socrates, very intelligent. Don't kill people. Let's just run away. Way smarter. Don't die. Just run. Jesus Christ. Don't kill people. Don't kill yourself. But in this pretty simple yet very profoundly reasonable hypothesis that the best option is to run away, this is kind of like one of the earliest ideas that we have that relates to game theory, even though it's not game theory. He's a philosopher. He is a sage, very, very wise man, right? He's not a game theorist. In fact, game theory did not even come, or at least the ideas were not talked about very, very deeply in a synthesized way until John Newman in, I believe, the 1930s or 40s, who was a Hungarian mathematician, started writing many things on game theory, including game theory and economic behavior, which is essentially the foundation for game theory. And it's very important to think about how this relates to poker, because poker is a game, right? And we can learn a lot about strategic decisions through studying game theory. Now, the foundations of John Newman's work, basically, the entire thing is about methods for finding mutually consistent solutions for two-person zero-sum games, which is very, very important. Now, at poker, we have many different formats, but understanding these ideas, I would like to just talk about heads up because it's far more simple. So I will only use the example of like two-person zero-sum games. And this also can be expanded to economics, politics, sports, obviously evolution as well. We have evolutionary game theory, many models for this to predict, but I mean, in those situations, I don't think the players have any strategic options. They're kind of just, they have their biological machine that they're using, and they're already predetermined. In poker, we actually have decisions that we can make. Game theory, contrary to like most conventional notions of games, actually refers to the interaction between multiple individuals, where each payoff is basically influenced by the decisions of other people. So the significance lies in its application to a variety of fields, offering like a fair framework for poker and the rest of our life, in producing like the most beneficial outcomes for not only us but everybody. Now, the principles of game theory, and when we think about the complexity, I don't want to talk. I'd rather just talk about one-on-one games because this is more of my expertise. So one of the main benefits in game theory, at least the framework which it provides, is the fact that we can use it for poker. We can think about the reward system, which are the payoffs in poker, and the assumption that our opponents are rational. Right? If they're not rational, then they will be much easier to exploit, but we ourselves deem ourselves rational, and we assume that our opponents are rational, unless they're recreational players. But of course, we are playing a game where we need to understand the game from first principle. And there's an approach which consists of simply thinking about our decisions compared to what we think our opponent is doing. This is absolutely brilliant, but it is a fractal piece of the whole puzzle. Now, there's a really good example. It's called the prisoner's dilemma, and it basically amplifies human nature's tendency toward like not really cooperating, and it basically shows the challenges of establishing mutually beneficial strategies. This is pretty difficult to do, but it illustrates it very well. There are a few YouTubers who have made video illustrations as well as been incredibly articulate and explained the prisoner's dilemma very well. I would certainly suggest looking at those, because I cannot give the example in even 5% of the way that they do, because their illustrations are absolutely brilliant. So I would suggest taking a look at those if you do have the time. Two of the most important concepts in game theory are dominant strategies and the Nash equilibrium. And a dominant strategy is one that is basically better for one player regardless of the opponent's choices. And then Nash equilibrium, which is named after John Nash, represents basically a state. It's called a state where you can not unilaterally increase your expectation. This basically means that no player will benefit from changing his strategy by himself, meaning that I will have a strategy and my opponent will have a strategy, and there's no way that I can increase the expectation by doing something like betting more, checking more, whatever, because my opponent has made me indifferent. No matter what I do, I have the same expectation. And the brilliance of Mr. John Nash, very intelligent man, his mind is absolutely astonishing, far beyond anything I can comprehend, is that in every game, even in poker, even in these very high stakes games against Linus Love, there's actually at least one point of equilibrium where no side actually is going to benefit from altering its course, in the sense that there is a point of indifference where you cannot increase your expectation against this strategy. Now, this intelligent, synthesis or revelation or whatever that Mr. Nash had extends far past poker. Actually, it goes to politics, war, the economy, business, social theories, and it basically gives people a framework for being able to strategize in their life and understand the world in a more effective way. Understand about the world and then how they can make decisions in the world. There's a pretty cool movie called 21. I don't actually know that it's relevant to this, but I just thought it was pretty cool because it sort of encapsulates some of the ideas in game theory, strategy, and strategic thinking. I mean, I kind of like it, but I'm not sure that it's relevant for game theory. There was a scene, anyways, there were some funny scenes. I like the movie. But game theory, you basically examine the interactions and outcomes, and then we try to make some sort of insights, try to navigate the complexities of poker, even though that poker is absolutely infinitely complex, and not very much can be said about that. And I want to give some examples as to how complex it is, but I'm not sure if I'll save that for a later video. But anyways, just by understanding the principles and understanding game theory from first principles, we can make some very strong informed decisions about how to play poker, and it will increase our ability to exploit our opponents far greater than they can exploit us. And this is very important, Because someone who is lacking in their theoretical knowledge of how the game works is going to be missing a huge chunk, and they will be memorizing and memorizing and memorizing strategies without actually a proper foundation. Because ultimately we can actually exploit people and model their mistakes in a very, very mathematical, precise way. And approaching strategy often involves relying on an exploitative mindset where your decisions are based on certain assumptions about your opponent, like, well, whether or not they're conscious or not, this still is the foundation of our gameplay. For instance, a common bit of poker advice: when I started playing poker, people were like, yo, when you raise pre-flop and you get to the flop, you always have to c-bet. If you're like, especially if your hand is not improved and you've not hit like second pair. But it's very important to realize that like it's not like a rigid rule that actually exists, right? The success of these kind of bets, this actually working out, sort of hinges on very specific assumptions about our opponent's tendencies. And at this time when I started playing, most of the tendencies were simply to call pre-flop pretty frequently and then fold easily to a flop bet, and not to re-raise pre-flop as a bluff, or excuse me, we're talking about post-flop. Say check raise as a bluff. But in different environments, especially when we start getting to tougher and tougher games, these assumptions or these tricks that we learned only work against certain models. And the challenge with exploitative play actually lies in the fact that our opponents are going to be actively trying to understand and counter our strategy. And whenever we adjust our play to exploit an anticipated mistake of our opponent, when we're saying we think our opponent does that, we inadvertently expose ourselves to potential exploitation, and this assumption that we know much more than them and we are much better than them. Well, we can believe this, but we have to look at like, what stakes are we playing? Not someone else. What stakes are we playing right now? And what is our win rate? And what is the average rigs win rate? And if we moved up in stakes, how would we do? So this assumption that we always know what's going on, absolute bullshit, and we will absolutely get destroyed if we move up against strong enough opposition. The majority of the poker world that's very tough has a strong understanding of how the game works. So whether you adjust to your... well, we don't even know what they're doing, right? But this anticipated mistake of our opponent, or not, we are still making decisions. And if our assumptions are incorrect and our opponent anticipates our strategy and deliberately attacks it contrary to our expectations, which of course nobody can do because we are perfect and no other ray can ever exploit us, no fish can ever exploit us for sure. How could a fish exploit a professional? Impossible. But basically, just going off of tricks and not understanding the deeper elements of poker, we can be very easily exploited, and it becomes very opponent to our opposition because the way that the mind works, we cannot see our eye. The eye cannot see the eye. So I'm going to give an example. For instance, take a decision that we're going to bluff very frequently based on the assumption that our opponent tends to fold too often. Now, this approach only makes money if it actually aligns with reality. In the sense that, like, if our opponent gets on a board and he's like, I got a bunch of weak hands, but my opponent also has a bunch of weak hands, and he thinks that I'm weak and he thinks that I'm going to fold, so therefore I should call. If he puts 2 and 2 together and he makes the call too often, our strategy is now extremely expensive for us, for our wallet. So game theory basically introduces or gives us a very distinct perspective on poker strategy because it operates under the assumption where we are viewing the game from a mathematically correct place. And we assume that our opponents are also rational and they will also make rational decisions. And if they will also try to exploit us. Of course, this idea that we know exactly what our opponents are doing, this is our strategy, this is what we're going to do, This is like for very, very low level thinking players. Of course, if we are somewhat good, we will realize, or we are just playing at low stakes, basically. And we need to move up. And if we're not moving up, it's mostly because we're probably scared of improving. And that's perfectly fine. There's no problem. But this is a channel for poker mind expansion. It's not a channel for entertainment. So I would assume that anybody that is watching this channel wants to improve. I certainly want to improve. So if our opponent ends up calling with a hand that only triumphs over a fucking bluff, we better have a good hand. But conversely, if they fold the same hand and our occasional bluff gets through, then it might reinforce this cognitive bias that, well, at least our tricks are very good. We know what we're doing. We know exactly how to win. So game theory is basically like a toolkit. It's not something to apply every single time at the table. It's not like a concept that you can apply at the table. That's not how concepts work. So you simply have an understanding of the game, and this increases. And if you are very insecure and you don't understand it, then you will cling to little ideas and say, I understand this, I understand that, I understand that. Obviously, no understanding can be defined. No understanding can be put into words. It is simply your schema. It cannot be conveyed. It's very important to consider it simply as a toolkit, but not to say it is a toolkit, I don't need it, I will throw it away. Because we need to learn how to adapt our strategy, and we need to be able to look for certain deviations from our opponent and think about how we can exploit them in a very precise way. Not based on religion, not based on belief, but based on math. Now, I want to think about the actual entirety of the decision tree. Let's just use heads up for an example, because I'm not going to go into the complexity of 9-handed or 6-handed. And that is infinitely more complex. It is not 6 times more complex. If you think that it is 3 or 6 or 5 or whatever times more complex, you don't understand anything about the exponential growth of how large this game is. I would absolutely suggest that, and of course we do as poker players understand this, but we are talking about the perspective of our opposition. And the majority of our win rate always comes from recreational players. So we have to understand how they perceive the game. The recreational players perceive the game in a very, very, very overly simplistic way. And in fact, because they do not have very much understanding of the game, they don't have the capacity to realize how complex it is. Einstein said that as your knowledge grows, your ignorance grows exponentially. This is a fact. One of my favorite men in history is Albert Einstein. If you take a look at his quotes, this man is absolutely amazing. He's such a beautiful human being. He is so humane and has such a beautiful heart, and he is so intelligent. One of the big things we really, really need to think about is how big is this game? Because it starts to show us our ignorance. Oh wow, maybe we don't understand GTO. Oh wow, maybe we don't always have the right decision. The problem is that when the mind studies, it only is looking for certainty. It's looking for solutions. It's not trying to increase its understanding of the game. How big is a heads-up game really? Say we're at like 100 big blinds, okay? And say we're... Well, anyways, we have to use at least cents, so there's not like infinite number of bet sizings that we can actually use, okay? So what we will say is that we're at 100 big blinds, and say we've got about like 21,000 possible flops, okay? And say that each decision point gives us about 10 different possibilities, 10 different actions. And it doesn't matter if that's what we choose to do. Say we only use one bet sizing. Our opponent might be using 50 different options, and we have to be able to model for this. So we have to see exactly how the growth of the tree is not only for our little strategy that we've modeled. Yes, we may have limited strategic decisions, but we have to understand how deep this game is. And most of the decision points will almost always lead to no action, just to play, of course. And many, 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 many of the leaves that actually happen very frequently end up just ending pre-flop or ending on the flop. So it's not like all these leaves are something that we can necessarily calculate. Or we can calculate it, but it's not something that we are necessarily going to see very often. And because of this, we can very easily say, well, it's not important. I'm just going to study pre-flop play because I see this all the time and I'm going to get this right. Absolutely not, because your pre-flop play is simply dependent on your expectations in the leaves, where your payoffs are. The leaves are, say, at the river, there are two opponents and they show their hands, and the person with the stronger hand wins the pot. This would be a leaf. Or we're on the turn, we bet, our opponent folds. This is a leaf. It is the end of a hand. So again, we're only talking about solving for heads up. We're not talking about solving for anything else. And say that like a hand, it goes like bet, raise, call on all the streets. So the distance between the root and the leaf is about 12. It's 12, right? If it goes on all streets, we've got 4 streets in poker. So 12 is a reasonable estimate for the average depth of the tree that we need. And this is not really true, because if you're playing 150 big blinds, it's going to be quite a bit larger. So this is a severe underestimate, in fact. So we're talking about 12. Now really we're saying 10 to the power of 12. And you've got about 1,300 possible combinations in no limit. It's a very, very, very large tree. And in terms of if you were going to put this onto a computer and you were going to try to GTO it, you're talking about thousands of terabytes of information. And you're talking about, and I'm not just giving a random number, I believe that it's probably more than about 5 billion, 10 billion books that you would put the entire strategy in. Just normal 500, 600, 700 page textbooks. We're talking about 5 billion of those. And we're drastically underestimating, because, frankly, there are definitely going to be more than 9 strategic options if you're playing against someone that wants to do whatever they want, and you want to really model this game very strongly. We could talk about 100 billion books. So we're using a very, very simplistic, only 100 big blind example. So GTO is obviously not something which can just be learned exactly by a human being and now we can use it at the table. And we're going to talk about the issues in a variety of ways in terms of how to incorporate game theory from the practical side into our play, and actually how to understand it at a deeper level from first principle. So what we will do is we'll study toy games, which are basically approximations of the full 6 max no limit, or heads up no limit. Or if you're playing live, the 9-handed. And these strategies that we find in the toy games will help us build our model as to how the game actually works. Not simply a model of what our opponent is doing and how we exploit it. We have to make these things very, very mathematically precise. So there are basically 2 ways to think about the different skills that are important in poker, at least when it comes to like making EV. The first one, which I think that the majority of poker players that play are pretty reasonable at this, but maybe they're reasonable at both, is the first one is identifying our opponent's strategy, how they're going to play their hands, what they do with this hand in this node, how often they check back and with what hands they check, with what hands they bet, etc. In other words, you could say, like, we're going to identify what range he takes in each decision with each action. We know the entirety of this game, right? This. Okay, so figuring out what is his strategy. The second thing is actually computing the response after we figure out what his strategy is, and his strategy cannot just be in our imagination. If we're not able to articulate what we think is going on, it means we simply just do not understand our imagination very well. Certainly we can put a lot of things into words as to why we are doing what we're doing. It does not mean that we are going to be able to compute it, but we are going to be able to put the why into words. And we can do this stuff very precisely with language, on pen and paper. It doesn't mean that other people have to agree, but we can start to understand our own assumptions. And basically, these 2 skills have nothing to do with each other. The first one essentially is just gathering the information. The second one is integrating it. The first one requires a very, very keen eye. We have to be able to observe very well. And our observations and our assumptions that come from there obviously are a derivative of our previous experience, of how we have played in the past and how other opponents have played against us. So once we know his strategy, finding the most profitable response is obviously just mathematical. It's very, 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 very simple if we are actually able to model it. Although experience and work away from the table is going to be very beneficial, of course, and modeling it away from the table is how we actually do it. And it's not necessarily with solvers. Some of the best ways is simply to think about things logically. I would often say that in I would say that probably the first idea about gathering information would be very beneficial if you were playing in the WSOP and you were only playing against this guy for a little bit of time. We want to identify what he's doing and we want to come up with a quick strategy to beat that. So that's kind of acceptable if you're not so good at the second one. But if you're a cash game player, the second one is like 10,000 times more important, and both are absolutely fundamental. Both skills are imperative to being able to think strategically at the poker table. So anyways, these skills are basically independent of each other. And it's very important to develop both of them to have a very clear and precise thought process. If you're a very good hand reader and you know what they're doing, it doesn't fucking matter if you're making terrible adjustments because you've not gone off the table and thought about how to adjust properly. On the other hand, if you're making just plays based on feel without explicitly identifying the reasons behind them, you're only going to be as good as those tendencies which if you've happened to come across through luck or trial and error. You have to explicitly identify your opponent's tendencies on pen and paper or in your mind, but in a very clear way. And then think about the best response. This is the way to study poker. It is not just to go to Pio Solver. There are so many different skills in poker, and these are the most important when it comes to thinking about how to make money and not just click buttons and hope that we get lucky. So strategy identification certainly arises first in actual play, since we have to figure out what villain's range is first, and then we figure out how we're going to exploit them. But I think that it's probably best to begin the discussion with the second point. So we will already assume that we know village strategies, and then we can talk about some examples and ideas of how to adjust against different types of strategies. Now, in some sense, you could say it's easier to actually discuss what to do than figure out an unknown strategy. It depends on if you're good at identifying what your opponents are doing. But they both are very, very complex and very important, and they cannot be underestimated. So I want to talk a little bit about expected value and what that actually means, because I say EV, I'm taking EV away from this guy's hand when I'm playing a play and explain, but I want this to be very, very clear and precise as to the meaning. Now, very often when discussing EV, I hear people discussing it from the perspective of I am on the turn, and this is 0 EV if I fold. This is not how I discuss EV personally. I discuss EV from pre-flop. I always think about EV starting from pre-flop. That's the only practical way that I can think about it personally. I understand that this is not necessarily how training videos speak of it, but there's a very good book. It's called Expert Guide to No Limit Hold'em by Will Tipton. A friend introduced me to it, and this is kind of the framework that I have used personally. There have also been some game theory books that I've read, and they have kind of given me a very similar framework to try to, if you have a big problem, don't just think about the EV from a narrow from a very small part of the game tree in order to make myself feel better about whatever decision I'm at. I have to think about it holistically. So it's let's give an example of rolling a dice. Okay, so let's say we roll a fair-sided dice, 6-sided, and we can land on any of the numbers 1 to 6. And each of these outcomes is, of course, going to be equally likely. It's not rigged. It's fair. So the probability is 1 in 6. Now, to find the average value of a single roll, we have to add up the value of each of the possible outcomes or results multiplied by the chance of that. So the expected value of rolling a dice will be 3.5. So of course, you cannot roll a 3.5, right? However, if you roll a very, very large number of times, then you're going to average 3.5. Now, technically, we can talk about like expected value from many different quantities whose values are uncertain. But in poker, our stack size is by far the most important perspective. And I think that when we talk about a poker hand, we need to think about it from pre-flop, because there are not 3 streets, there are 4 streets in poker. And this is fundamental because all of our decisions start pre-flop. And all of the EV all of the payoffs, I should say, are in the leaves. So these decisions in the first street of action are obviously not ending at the flop. They end whenever we get paid. And when we get paid, we are much more likely to get laid. And if we care about getting laid, it's very important that we study and listen to what I said. That was very silly. So for instance, I'm playing 500 Zoom and I get to a flop, right? And I say, well, the EV of calling this against a C-bet is blah, blah, blah. What do I mean the EVs of calling this is blah, blah, blah? The expectation of our stack at the end of the hand, if I make this decision to call, is X. So we start pre-flop. We get to the flop. We get to the turn. There are no independent streets. This is very, very, very important. When we're faced with a poker decision, we generally seek to find the expected value of our stack after taking one of the options available to us, averaging over things we cannot control, like cards that will come. We cannot control which ones come out. That is just the poker gods. We don't know necessarily what our opponent is holding as well. I mean, sure, we can give them a range, but then they're actually holding 2 cards. So we can make the most money on average by going with the choice that has the largest expectation. Very, very simple shit, but I hate to say such simple shit, but it's important to actually lay out this framework, because it's very easy to say, yeah, I know how to dribble, I know how to, do my good footwork, I just want to shoot the basketball all day long. But actually, like, the most important thing is working on the fundamentals, and getting the fundamentals very, very, very clear as well. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of maximally exploitative strategies. And this is the most profitable response to a particular fixed strategy of our opponent that we know. In game theory, I believe it's called best response strategy. Some people say this is optimal. I mean, in game theory, that has a very, very specific meaning, so I will not use the word optimal. I'd say best response is if we're all going to get together and use this thing called language, talking about poker, I think it's far better to say our exploitative strategy is a best response strategy. We cannot talk about it and say the word optimal. Certainly we can, but it's a little bit confusing. But it's very important. Well, say we're trying to find our best response strategy. And this means that we are trying to maximize the value of the game for us, of course. So on this channel, that's actually kind of the point, is to think about maximally exploitative strategies and not just GTO. That's literally the point. But I wanted to introduce GTO because it's very important. I'm not going to cover any of that right now in this video. I just basically want to describe the mechanical procedure of finding an exact response to a fixed strategy. And it could be very, very computationally intensive. There's this thing called PioSolver, and then it has this feature called node locking. Unfortunately, this only works on one street. There are some more complicated solvers that have some extra additions that we can use, that we can model rather than locking one particular thing and seeing the maximally exploitative strategy. We are actually able to model and say that they over c-bet a little bit like this compared to that. I believe that there is public software available for this because I'm using it. And it's very, very effective. It's far more effective than using node lock. 10,000 times more effective than using node lock. Because node lock is fucking obvious as shit. If you're going to use node lock, what is the strategy? He bets too much. Well, duh, but we're only in one street, right? We have to think about this from pre-flop. We cannot just simply get to a street and saying he says he does this or he does that. Using tools that are actually relevant and solving the right problems, this is a very important thing when it comes to actually finding the correct responses, not only figuring out what they're doing, but then finding mathematically correct responses. So we're trying to find the most profitable response to whatever strategy we said they have. It's very important to notice this simple fact. Our most profitable overall strategy, I know it's so obvious to us poker players, but I want to say this very clearly because I have the tendency to play against recreational players sometimes, and I see myself betting 1/3 and just doing this autopilot thing that I've learned. But it's very important to talk about what a maximally exploitative strategy actually is. Every single individual combination of our whole cards has to be played to the highest profitability according to the math. That is a maximally exploitative strategy, assuming that we can model what they are doing. And the better we are, the better models that we will be able to make. And basically the value of this is just our average expected dollars with any pair of hole cards. So for a fixed opponent, we're going to be able to maximize the expectation of every single pair of hole cards that we have. We're not burdened by this idea that pre-flop GTO says this, well, I can't open this. No, because every single decision point we're thinking about what our opponent is doing. So if we're playing against a recreational player, part of our decision-making process is figuring out whether or not he's even able to adjust and figure out what it is that we're doing, and if he's going to be able to find a counter strategy. If he's not, trying to play GTO strategies against recreational players is absolutely abysmal. It means we're solving the wrong problem. So it's important to realize that our recreational player friends actually may be able to do some adjusting, but probably not much. But this maximally exploitative strategy that we are talking about basically involves making the same decision every single time in a particular situation, in the sense that we are playing a particular hand in the same way every single time, because we're playing it in the most profitable possible way, and we've already modeled our opponent's play. The only exception that I can even think of, I mean, maybe if something is of equal value, like another decision is the same EV, which against a fish is very unlikely. I mean, it's just not likely at all. It's very, very, very unlikely. We might not be able to model which one is higher, but we can more or less say, if we're not able to model it against a recreational player, I should be very honest and direct that we're probably not very good. So it's very important that we improve our skills of trying to beat recreational players and take the most away from them, because that's where the majority of our money is coming from. Now, maximally exploitative strategies don't have any kind of like, I'm just going to bet this time because I want to make sure that he sees that I bluffed this hand, and I don't want him to see that I'm checking this on the river, then he'll therefore adjust and he won't call next time, so I'm just going to bluff this anyways. There's no like loss leader type of plays to play this hand less profitable in this moment for the sake of our whole strategy. And this maybe is a little bit unintuitive to a lot of GTO masters out there. I mean, not literally GTO masters, just I'm being slightly sarcastic. That actually was not very kind. I think sarcasm means like the tearing of flesh. I'm essentially trying to make fun of myself because I'm very silly, and sometimes I play against recreational players in a very autopilot-y format, but I'm not very nice to myself, am I? For being so sarcastic. But anyways, the point is that it's very unintuitive to the mind, and it may go against the ideas of balance. Certainly it goes against the idea of balance that I have. So these kind of notions that I have about balance playing against a recreational player, bet 1/3, it's absolute bullshit. And it only even comes up whatsoever when we assume that our opponent is going to be able to adapt. And if he doesn't understand how to adapt, then it doesn't really matter very much, because we'll be able to model for how he's likely to adapt on average, because we're playing a game of averages. So if there is a particular takeaway from this video, I would like it to be that when we are playing recreational players, we need to be thinking in terms of maximal exploitation. We need to be thinking in terms of how can we take the most money away from this guy. And there's no presupposition as to, well, optimal EV here is X, so therefore it should... Not at all, because then we're just putting boxes around the way that we're playing. I think it's been about 40 minutes now, and I'm getting a little bit tired. I love you all so much. Thank you guys for joining me. I'm so happy. And I will be making more videos about game theory and its application to poker, and how we can try to use it practically, not just hear concepts and then whatever, but really try to understand how we're going to apply it at the table, because this is the crux of the issue. Poker is absolutely a mathematical game. So I think starting from first principles, very, very, very fundamental. Love you all, and goodbye.